So I wonder if there is an intentional choice that you have ever made that didn't fit your family's or your community's expectations. If there's ever been a time when you've done something, some of you are like, duh. And if there's ever been a time when you have done something, made a choice, made a decision that didn't fit your family's and your community's expectations, and then what was the response? What was that like? What was said or done or not said? So I'm going to tell you a story about one of my choices. So I grew up in a community and a church and an extended multi-generational family with a deeply held value of Christian education for children. And my husband, Billy, grew up in a community, a church, and an extended family with a deeply held value of public education for children. So as we find ourselves married, we have a choice to make. And both of those family traditions or historical choices that our respective families have made are rooted in our family's Christian faith, with different convictions around how to live that faith out. So when the time came for us to choose a school for our oldest, as he approached that age, we decided, as we examined our own values and what we wanted to be true in the world and for our family and for our neighborhood, we decided that our value of deep engagement with our neighbors was leading us to choose the neighborhood public school. In some ways, it was a super easy choice because our neighborhood public school is excellent. That if your neighborhood school is not excellent, that changes how you make those choices. But in some ways, it was an easy choice for us, but in some ways, it was a tough choice because we knew that my family would be disappointed. Isn't that a loaded word, disappointed? It meant that we were stepping out of their understanding of the best ways for Christians to relate to the world. And word passed around my family like it was a devastating secret. Did you hear Mar and Billy are going to send their kids to the public school? And one of my nieces, who was a young teenager at the time, thought that her sweet little 5-year-old cousin was going straight to hell. It's an actual conversation that was had. So now this is not a sermon against Christian schools. There are certainly valid reasons and Christ-following values that can lead to that choice. And there are situations in which Christian schools bring a lot of value and profound goodness to the world. But in my particular family and community at that particular time, Christian education was a status symbol more than an informed choice. And the status that it symbolized was that of an insider. If you are part of this community, we send our kids to a Christian school. That's how you are one of us. That's how you sort of let the world know that you are part of this community, as opposed to being one of them who send their kids to public schools. So it was much more of a status symbol of insider, and what it symbolized was the status of being an insider versus the status of being an outsider. It wasn't only that, but that was a big part of it. And in our community, it was exclusionary as well. There were 2 families in my church who didn't send their children to Christian schools because they were poor and couldn't afford the tuition, even with the tuition assistance that the church offered, and they couldn't attain that insider status. And they definitely were thought of as less than. And so, it was not just a different choice of a different school. It was so much more than that. And the choice to step outside of that, to choose something other than what our community expected, raised the question of, are they an insider or an outsider? Now, this is all settled out, and it's been more than a decade, or maybe not more than a decade, almost a decade, and things have evolved, and it's all fine. But it was definitely a salient memory and an important experience of the values of a community. So that's my story. What's yours? When have you made an intentional choice that didn't fit your family's or your community's expectations? And what was the response? So today we're going to hear one of Jesus' many stories about making intentional choices that didn't fit his community's expectations. Times when he turned his back on the symbols of insider and outsider status, choosing to become labeled or risk becoming labeled as an outsider for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So it's about following the rules on the Sabbath day. And I know that for some of you, this has been one of those choices of how you live on Sundays that has put you outside of your community's expectations. For Jesus, these rules were an important status symbol. So these rules about what they could and couldn't do on the Sabbath were passed down through many generations. And the intent of these rules, as we sort of deduce from, well, we don't have to deduce it, it flat out says it. The intent of the rules given in the Old Testament was to set this community apart from their neighbors, to provide structure for their community so that they could fulfill their purpose to be a blessing to the world. To form them together as a community so that they could be a blessing to the world. That's what God told Abraham, who was the spiritual ancestor of the Jewish people, including Jesus. God told Abraham when God called him that he would be blessed so that his descendants could be a blessing to the world. That was the purpose of all these rules that they had. It would set them apart so that they could be a blessing. So we fast forward a couple of thousand years, and the Jewish people are under the oppression of the Romans in the time of Jesus, where we pick up the story today. And segments of the population of Jews were pretty dogged in following these rules and upholding this important symbol of their community. And as an oppressed people, whose livelihood and very identity was threatened by the people in power, by the Romans, following these rules was one way that they could hold on to their identity. It was a way that they could live out who they were when other options weren't available to them. It was a way that they could grasp for that blessing that they so desperately wanted and needed. So let's be a little bit careful about our judgmentalism toward these Pharisees. The problem was that they forgot about the second part, that their being blessed was for the purpose of blessing others. So we're going to read this story about how Jesus breaks the rules and what happens. And as we read, there's two sort of separate stories smashed together here about how the Pharisees act on the Sabbath and what the community expectations are, and then how Jesus and his disciples live out the Sabbath, and they come into contact with one another. So it's from Mark chapter 2. This is the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, starting at verse 23, and we're going to read through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, he, that being Jesus, was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food?" David was an ancient king in the Jewish history. Ancient and well-loved king. How he entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now we move into chapter 3. Again, he, that being Jesus, entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They were watching him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. They're looking to trap Jesus. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So the ancient Jews, particularly the Pharisees' expression of their identity and of their hope for the future and who they were called to be had become reduced to perfect adherence to the Sabbath law. Maybe without a lot of other options for them of how they could act out their identity, this was one that they held on to. That the perfect following of these rules of the Sabbath would somehow usher in their hopes for the future where God would liberate them from their oppressors. That seems like a good and understandable way to live. Except the problem that Jesus points out here is that it was exclusive. It was only about identifying themselves as insiders among the Jewish people, and it wasn't about that second part of "you are blessed to be a blessing" that God had told Abraham, that these rules weren't just for their own identity and expression of who they are over against everyone else, but that it was also for the purpose of creating a Sabbath world. Creating a Sabbath world where there was rest, where there was provision, and not just for them, but for everyone. And who got left out of those Sabbath expressions, following those Sabbath rules? Who got left out of those? The rules of things you couldn't do. You couldn't travel further than a certain amount of steps or feet or whatever their unit of measurement was. You couldn't do certain kinds of food preparation. There were all things that required advanced planning. If you were going to follow the Sabbath, you had to plan for it throughout the whole week. And those who were excluded were the people who didn't have the resources to plan ahead. It's the marginalized people that Jesus tends to in this story. It's the poor, the sick, and the wanderers. Those who have to gather grain from the edges of fields as they travel around. Those who are kind of stuck where they are because their bodies don't allow them to move to other places, like the man with the withered hand. And so Jesus breaks the letter of the law to show that their hoped-for future is actually about feeding the hungry and healing the sick, and that it isn't just something that they hope for in the future, but that it is already happening, and they can participate in it in the here and the now. Jesus shows the bigger purpose of these Sabbath laws, which was to be for the healing of God's people, for the healing of creation, for the provision for the poor. Whereas they were just stuck in checking the boxes. So I wonder, what status symbols do you strive to exhibit? What are the symbols of the status that you hope to live into? The practices that you enact on a daily, weekly, monthly basis so that you can Be the kind of person that you want other people to see you as. We all have them, and I want us to be super careful not to get so wrapped up in saying, yes, you, about the rules, that you shouldn't be that way, you shouldn't exclude, because when you point one finger out, there's all these fingers pointing back at you. We all do this. One thing, I just want to pick out one of them today. And it's something I've learned from those of you who are adjusting to retirement. And I think that exhaustion has become a status symbol. For many of us, exhaustion has become a status symbol. That we want to be seen as people who are doing a lot, people who are succeeding, people who are equipping our kids to succeed and giving them every opportunity. And so exhaustion is a status symbol for a successful person. But you see, right, how exhaustion is counterproductive. Exhaustion doesn't contribute to the kind of life that you might value about a successful person. That a successful person is someone who has a sense of purpose, someone who has a strong work ethic, someone who cares about their community and their families and their work. But exhaustion makes all of those things null and void in the same way that empty rule following made the practices of the kingdom of heaven null and void. So what is your attainment of a status symbol causing you to miss about the kingdom of heaven that is present here and now? I think for exhaustion, it's kind of obvious, but for some of you, it will be less obvious. What is the status symbol that you try to attain, that you try to show out in the world, that actually blocks you from living the fully alive life that God created you for, that Jesus was born for and lived for and died for and rose again and ascended to heaven for? Don't miss the kingdom of heaven breaking forth in your midst for the sake of a status symbol. Will you join me in prayer? God, your time in your 33 years on earth were often spent saying things like, the kingdom of heaven is like, to show us how to understand your purposes and your dream for humanity and the meaning of your work. The kingdom of heaven is like. And our imaginations get that all wrong sometimes. We imagine that the kingdom of heaven is like a fully funded IRA account. We think that the kingdom of heaven is like an amazing vacation. We think that the kingdom of heaven is like giving our kids every possible opportunity to the point of exhaustion. Shape us today into your vision of the kingdom of heaven, that we may enjoy it and live into it now and be part of sharing it with your world. In your name we pray, amen.